I want you to close your eyes for just a second. I mean, imagine stepping right out of a time machine. The doors hiss open, the chronological dust settles, and you step out onto this sun-baked, precisely paved street.
Right into the chaos.
Exactly. The year is 79 CE. You are in the bustling heart of Pompeii. You're exhausted from a morning at the Forum, and you are just absolutely starving. You have places to be, but as you look around, there are, no glowing golden arches.
No drive-through speaker box to yell into.
Right. There's no fast food sign anywhere. You'd think fast food was this uniquely modern invention, right? Like born out of the 1950s American highway system or industrial agriculture. But then hitting you right in the face is this overwhelming wall of scent.
Oh, yeah. The smells would be intense.
Beyond intense, you smell the sharp, sulfuric bite of roasting onions, the heavy aroma of sizzling mutton on skewers, and beneath all of that, this deeply funky, intense umami tang that you just can't quite place.
The garam.
The gorum. We'll get to that. But you follow your nose to a brightly painted shop, completely open to the street. There's this long, L-shaped masonry counter facing the sidewalk, and embedded right into that stone are these massive, steaming clay jars. You drop a couple of small bronze coins on the counter, a vendor labels something hot and savory into a bowl, and suddenly, you are eating, standing up, just watching the chariots and the crowds rush by.
It's such a visceral image.
It really is. So the historical sources we are diving into today prove that the ancient world didn't just have quick service dining, they actually relied on it for the absolute survival of their empires. We're looking at the mechanics of ancient urban density and, more importantly, the evolution of social friction in dining. So, welcome. You're listening to a deep dive into the ancient archive blueprints, specifically their discussion series called Deep Dives, Decoding the Pillars of History. And today, we're looking at this massive stack of historical notes, academic papers, and translated primary texts you sent us to build this out. The mission today is to explore the messy, brilliant, and honestly deeply human origins of modern thought.
And what's fascinating here is that the sheer scale of urban life in antiquity absolutely demanded this infrastructure. Like,
Right.
when we look at these texts, we realize that the physical realities of packing up to 1 million people into a tight geographical space.
Which Rome did at its peak, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like the city of Rome at its peak. That required a fundamental reimagining of how calories were distributed. Eating on the street wasn't, a leisure activity or a convenient luxury for the ancient working class.
It wasn't like grabbing a quick bite because you didn't feel like cooking.
No, it was a rigorous biological necessity. And it was driven by real estate, architecture, and the omnipresent threat of catastrophic urban fire.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the architectural reality is exactly where we need to start. I think we tend to visualize the Roman world through this very specific lens, right? Sprawling marble villas, massive mosaic courtyards.
Dedicated smoke-ventilated kitchens.
Yeah, the Hollywood version.
Yep.
But the demographic reality was entirely different. The vast majority of the population, the plebeians, the merchants, the freedmen, they were living in insulae. And from the sources, these multi-story apartment blocks sound like, frankly, structural nightmares.
Oh, they were terrifying. They were heavily timbered, poorly engineered tenement buildings, often rising 5, 6, or even 7 stories high.
7 stories made of wood.
Yeah. The lower floors might be built of stone or concrete, but the upper floors were almost entirely wood and wattle and daub. And crucially, these apartments lacked running water, and they entirely lacked dedicated cooking spaces or chimneys.
Right, and if you don't have a chimney, you don't have a safe way to vent smoke. So bringing a charcoal brazier into a cramped 4th-floor wooden apartment isn't just a nuisance. I mean, it's a profound liability.
It's basically a death wish. You're one knocked-over ember away from taking out the entire city block.
Wow.
Frequently. The city of Rome suffered devastating, city-altering fires repeatedly throughout its history. I mean, the Great Fire of 64 CE under Nero is just the most famous example. So the municipal authorities and landlords essentially made indoor cooking a massive taboo.
Or outright illegal in certain structures, right?
Exactly, especially for the poor. You couldn't cook at home, and without refrigeration, you certainly couldn't store raw meat or dairy in a sweltering apartment in the middle of the Italian summer. Therefore, the caloric intake of the entire lower and middle class had to be outsourced to the street.
Which brings us back to that counter in Pompeii. The Romans called these establishments Thermopolia, which literally translates to hot chops, and the sheer volume of them is just staggering to me.
The density is incredible.
Right. Archaeologists have identified nearly 90 distinct Thermopolia within the excavated sections of Pompeii alone. For a city with an estimated population of maybe 11 to 12,000 people at the time of the eruption, having 90 fast food joints is an incredibly high density,
It's essentially one hot food counter for every 130 residents.
which is a better ratio than most modern cities have for coffee shops.
It really is. That ratio tells us this was the bedrock of their daily routine. And the engineering of these thermopolia was brilliantly tailored to high-volume, rapid-fire service.
Let's talk about that engineering because it's so clever.
It is. So the counters themselves were constructed of heavy masonry, which acts as a fantastic thermal mass. And embedded deep into that masonry were the dolia, these large, wide-mouthed terracotta jars.
Okay, I want to break down the thermodynamics of those jars. Because modern quick-service restaurants use, electrically heated stainless steel inserts suspended over boiling water to keep food at a safe holding temperature.
A classic steam table.
Exactly. But the Romans were achieving a similar effect passively, right?
They were, because terracotta is highly porous, but when it's properly sealed and embedded into thick masonry, it becomes an excellent insulator.
So the stone itself is doing the work.
Precisely. The heavy stone counter absorbed the ambient heat of the shop and the radiant heat from the small cooking fires behind the counter, insulating the jars. A vendor could cook a massive batch of lentil stew or garbanzo bean soup at dawn, transfer it to the dolia, and the thermal mass of the masonry would keep that food at a safe, hot serving temperature for hours.
Wow. Without needing a constant direct flame underneath it.
Right. It was an incredibly energy-efficient way to hold food for a massive lunch rush.
And thanks to a spectacular excavation in Pompeii that concluded in 2020, we don't even have to speculate about what was actually in those jars.
Oh, the Regio V excavation. That was a game changer.
It was amazing. Archaeologists uncovered a pristine Thermopolium in the Regio V neighborhood. The counter was decorated with these vibrant, incredibly detailed frescoes that functioned essentially as an ancient menu board.
It depicted mallard ducks, roosters,
And even a dog on a leash, which thankfully the experts say likely served as a warning to potential thieves rather than, a menu item.
yeah, a beware of dog sign, essentially.
Exactly. But the physical residues inside the jars were what really caught my attention. They found fragments of duck bone, goat, pig, fish, and land snails, all cooked together in what appears to be a mixed meat stew.
And the inclusion of land snails is particularly telling about the complexity of the Roman supply chain, because snails weren't just forage, they were a highly cultivated food source.
Wait, they were farming snails?
Oh, extensively.
Yeah.
The Romans actually engineered specialized enclosures called cochlearia just to breed and fatten snails. They often fed them milk and spelt to improve their flavor before bringing them to market.
Milk-fed snails. That is wild.
So finding them in a street-side dolia implies that the fast food network was deeply integrated with specialized agricultural production outside the city walls.
It's a far cry from a generic chicken nugget, that's for sure.
Huh.
But no matter what protein you were buying at that counter, the sources make it explicitly clear that it was going to be drenched in one specific condiment. We have to talk about garum.
Ah, the ancient world's ketchup.
Ketchup, soy sauce, and MSG all rolled into one. But the chemical process of making it is entirely reliant on controlled decay, which sounds horrifying.
It is a profound lesson in biochemistry. So garum is a fermented fish sauce. Roman producers would take the viscera, the intestines, blood, and gills of fatty fish like mackerel or sardines.
Okay, gross.
Just wait. They would layer these parts in massive open-air vats with a very precise ratio, of course, sea salt, and then leave those vats out in the baking Mediterranean sun for 2 to 3 months.
Wait, leaving raw fish guts in the Italian sun for months? That seems like a guaranteed recipe for putrefaction. I mean, how does adding salt prevent this from just turning into hazardous rotting sludge and giving everyone botulism?
The mechanics lie in the salinity and the natural enzymes of the fish. By introducing a massive concentration of salt, usually a ratio of about 1 part salt to 8 parts fish,
Right.
they created a hypersaline environment.
Meaning it's too salty for bad stuff to grow.
Exactly. Harmful bacteria that cause rot and dangerous pathogens simply cannot survive in that level of salinity. However, the salt does not stop the natural digestive enzymes present in the fish intestines.
Oh, so the fish is digesting itself.
Essentially, yes. Those enzymes continue to work, breaking down the proteins of the fish into distinct amino acids, primarily glutamate.
Glutamate, so they were essentially synthesizing pure liquid umami.
That's exactly what it is. Along with halophilic or salt-loving bacteria, the enzymes undergo proteolysis, physically liquefying the fish tissue over the course of months.
That is disgusting and genius at the same time.
The solids are eventually strained out, leaving behind a clear amber liquid that is incredibly savory, deeply pungent, and completely safe to consume. It was a flavor profile so essential to the Roman palate that its production was a massive empire-wide industry.
That industry scale brings up a major contradiction in the historical record that we really need to untangle here. Because if you read the surviving Roman literature, the letters, the satires, the historical accounts written by elite figures like Juvenal or Horace, they openly despise these street vendors.
Oh, they were vicious about it.
Right. They write about the Thermopolia and the sit-down taverns, the popinae, as absolute dens of vice. They claim these places were filled with thieves, runaway slaves, and assassins. To an elite Roman patrician, being seen eating at a public counter was intensely shameful. It was basically social suicide.
Well, that was a carefully curated literary narrative, yes. The elite patrician class relied heavily on the optics of the private, elaborate banquet to signal their power and wealth.
Right, the whole look how much I can afford to waste aesthetic.
Exactly. To eat standing up on the street was to align yourself visually with the urban poor who had no other choice.
But the math of the archaeological record completely shatters that narrative. I mean, if Pompeii alone had nearly 90 of these counters and they were centrally located on the busiest thoroughfares right next to elite villas, they couldn't have just been catering to destitute laborers.
The economics wouldn't support it.
Exactly. And furthermore, the amphorae found in these shops often contained residues of imported premium goods. Garum itself was heavily graded, right?
It was. The highest quality, known as garum sociorum, was imported from specialized factories in southern Spain and North Africa.
And it was exorbitantly expensive. So you do not stock premium imported Spanish fish sauce if your entire customer base is impoverished. Were the elites secretly grabbing a garum-soaked skewer when their friends weren't looking?
The physical evidence demands that conclusion. The elites were absolutely patronizing these establishments, even if they were doing it discreetly, or sending their slaves to bring the food back to their villas.
So the literary sneering was basically a form of overcompensation.
Exactly. By loudly condemning the popinae in their writing, the elites were desperately trying to maintain a rigid social boundary that, in the physical reality of the city streets, was actually quite porous. The hot counter was a shared community resource.
Which makes the Roman street corner this fascinating space of unacknowledged social mixing. But if we rewind a bit and travel east to ancient Greece, specifically looking at Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, that social mixing vanishes.
Completely different vibe.
Yeah, in Greece, the fast food scene becomes an intense, highly formalized battleground of social class. The way you ate in Athens was heavily weaponized to signal exactly where you stood in the political hierarchy, or rather, whether you stood at all.
Posture is the defining metric of the Greek culinary experience. To understand the Athenian street food scene, we first have to understand what it was reacting against, which is the symposium.
The famous Greek drinking party.
Right. The symposium was the dining experience of the ultra-wealthy, aristocratic Greek male. It was fiercely exclusive, deeply private, and held in a dedicated room of the home called the andron.
And the architecture of the andron is so specific. It wasn't just a dining room. It was physically designed to enforce a specific bodily posture.
Yes, the floors often had raised borders specifically built to accommodate the clean-eye, the dining couches.
They weren't pulling up chairs to a communal table.
No, they were reclining on their left elbows, eating with their right hands.
Which, if you've ever tried it, reclining is a biomechanically inefficient way to eat. It requires significantly more effort to pass food and pour drinks when everyone is sprawled on couches.
But that inefficiency was the entire point. Reclining telegraphed a very specific message. I am so thoroughly insulated from the demands of manual labor, and my property is so secure that I can consume my calories in a state of total, vulnerable relaxation.
I have slaves to bring the food to my mouth.
Precisely. The symposium was a ritualized theater of the elite, designed to reinforce their shared aristocratic bonds through poetry, intricate drinking games, and philosophical debate, completely shielded from the public eye.
But if you weren't an aristocratic landowner, if you were a potter, a merchant, or just a working-class citizen, you didn't have an andron. You headed to the capitalion, the public tavern.
And this space operated on the exact opposite architectural logic. It was open to the street, and it was standing room only.
Stripping away the couches was a profoundly democratic architectural choice, wasn't it?
It really was. When you force everyone to stand or lean at a counter, you strip away the immediate physical markers of extreme leisure. You force proximity.
Right, you can't be aloof if you're elbow to elbow.
Exactly. In the Capitalian, a tradesman, a passing merchant, and perhaps even a slave running an errand might all be standing shoulder to shoulder buying wine by the cup. In a city like Athens, which prided itself on its radical, albeit exclusive to male citizens, democracy, the standing room tavern acted as a vital social equalizer.
And the food in the Greek agora, the central market, sounds remarkably fresh compared to the heavily stewed Roman fare. Vendors were hawking fresh bread, salty cheeses, grilled fish, and sausages right off the braziers. But if you were drinking in the Capitalion, you were probably eating trigemata.
Ah, yes. Trachomata essentially translates to things to munch on. We're talking about roasted chickpeas, salted almonds, dried figs, and heavily brined olives.
So bar snacks.
Exactly. They served the exact same economic function as the bowl of heavily salted pretzels at a modern dive bar.
Which is to make you thirsty.
Yes. The high sodium content suppresses the perception of bitterness and alcohol while triggering an intense osmotic thirst response in the bottle, compelling the patron to purchase more wine. It is an economic feedback loop that has remained completely unchanged for 2.5 millennia.
That is brilliant and a little devious. But the wine itself, however, requires a serious physiological breakdown because the Greek methodology defies modern logic. The sources are definitive on this point. The Greeks absolutely never drank their wine neat.
No.
They always diluted it with water, and the standard ratio was usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Now, wait a minute. If the municipal water supply in antiquity was largely untreated and potentially harboring dangerous bacteria, wouldn't taking a perfectly sterile fermented liquid like wine and diluting it with 3 parts of suspect well water just create a massive vector for waterborne illness? Like, were they just drinking dirty grape water?
It's a highly logical counterpoint, but it misunderstands the microbiology of ancient wine and the chemical reaction of dilution. Ancient Greek wines were not like modern filtered table wines.
Right, they weren't pouring a delicate Pinot Noir.
Not at all. They were often much higher in residual sugars and potentially higher in alcohol content, sometimes naturally fermenting up to 15 or 16%. And they were frequently thick with grape must, resins, and sometimes even seawater added for preservation.
Seawater, so it was closer to a highly concentrated syrup or a liquor than a modern wine.
Exactly. But more importantly, the act of mixing wine and water doesn't just dilute the alcohol. It alters the pH of the water. Wine is inherently acidic. When you introduce wine into suspect water, even at a 1:3 ratio, the combination of the remaining alcohol content and the sudden drop in the water's pH creates a mildly hostile environment for many common enteric pathogens.
Oh, wow. So it's essentially purifying the water.
It doesn't completely sterilize it, but it significantly reduces the bacterial load. The Greeks were unknowingly utilizing acidulation to make their public water supply safer to drink.
That entirely recontextualizes the practice. It wasn't just about pacing their intoxication. It was an intuitive public health measure. Though the pacing was deeply important to their cultural identity, too, right?
Absolutely. The sources note that drinking undiluted wine was viewed as completely barbarian. The goal of the tavern wasn't obliteration, it was a highly calibrated buzz.
They wanted just enough alcohol to lower social inhibitions and fuel intense political debate, because the Capitalion was essentially the shadow parliament of Athens, without losing the physical coordination required to actually walk home.
Exactly. And the logistics of supplying those taverns also reveal an incredibly advanced system of standardized trade. We tend to think of branding and industrial design as products of the Industrial Revolution, but the Greeks mastered this with the amphora.
The clay shipping jars. I've seen these in museums, but the sources point out that their specific shapes were strictly regulated. Right?
Highly regulated. An amphora wasn't just a generic vessel. Its physical silhouette was a legally protected trademark.
Wait, really?
Yes. The clay composition, the specific curve of the handle, the exact angle of the neck, and the taper of the base were dictated by the island or city-state that produced the wine inside. An Athenian tavern owner didn't need to read a printed label.
Because they could just look at the shape.
Right. They could look across a crowded, dimly lit storeroom and instantly identify a sharp-shouldered amphora from Chaos or a thicker, rounded vessel from Thasos. The industrial design of the ceramic itself communicated the origin, the expected quality, and the price point of the wine.
Pure functional branding. That is so far ahead of its time. So we have the Greeks utilizing standing room architecture to enforce democratic proximity, and we have the Romans utilizing heavy masonry to mass-produce hot stews for apartment dwellers. But when we leave the Mediterranean coast and travel south to ancient Egypt, the entire paradigm of urban dining shifts again.
It does. We move from rigid stone counters to a highly fluid, mobile economy dictated entirely by the rhythms of the Nile River.
Right. Moving to hubs like Thebes, or later the sprawling multicultural metropolis of Alexandria, requires us to completely abandon the idea of static brick-and-mortar fast food. The Egyptian model was far less formalized.
You didn't have streets lined with permanent stone thermopolia. The infrastructure was ephemeral. It was driven by mobile street vendors, massive open-air markets, and temporary stalls set up during the frequent, sprawling religious festivals.
The sources describe this Nile-side nibble culture that relied heavily on immediate local yields. The core menu for an Egyptian urbanite on the go was fresh river fish, massive volumes of raw onions and garlic, and above all else, beer.
Yes, beer.
But we need to clarify the zymology of ancient Egyptian beer because it bears absolutely no resemblance to a modern carbonated pilsner. The texts refer to it as a daily dietary staple.
It was, quite literally, liquid bread. The brewing process in ancient Egypt fundamentally differed from modern techniques. They utilized a deeply baked, heavily yeast-laden loaf of emmer wheat bread as the primary fermentable base.
They brewed with actual loaves of bread.
Yes. They would crumble these loaves into vats of water, often adding dates or honey for additional fermentable sugars, and allow the wild airborne yeast to trigger fermentation.
So that explains why the resulting liquid is described as thick and opaque. It must have been closer to a porridge than a beverage.
It was incredibly viscous. It often required the drinker to use a specialized straw with a built-in filter just to avoid inhaling large chunks of fermented grain.
Oh, that's wild, a built-in strainer.
Exactly. But the caloric density was massive. Because the fermentation process was relatively short, the alcohol by volume remained quite low, perhaps 2 to 3%, but the liquid retained all the complex carbohydrates of the grain.
So you're not getting drunk, you're getting fueled.
Right. Furthermore, the yeast synthesis produced a massive amount of essential B vitamins. For an Egyptian laborer constructing monumental architecture, or simply a merchant navigating the searing heat of the market, this beer wasn't an intoxicant. It was a high-efficiency calorie delivery system. It was the ancient equivalent of a modern meal replacement shake.
That makes the visual of the Egyptian morning commute incredible. Like grabbing a bowl of thick, carbohydrate-dense beer and a raw onion from a riverside vendor to fuel a 12-hour workday. But I keep bumping up against the climatic reality of this region.
The heat.
Yes, we are talking about an advanced, high-volume food economy operating in a hyper-arid, intensely hot desert environment. How do you maintain a mobile market selling fresh fish and thick-grain porridge in 110-degree heat without massive outbreaks of food poisoning? Since the evidence isn't as brick and mortar, was it just a free-for-all?
Not at all. The Egyptian mastery of food preservation was arguably the most advanced chemical engineering of the ancient world. They understood that the enemy of preservation is moisture.
Because bacteria and mold need water to grow.
Exactly. Bacteria and mold require free water to multiply. So the Egyptians attacked the moisture content of their food through several distinct vectors. The first was aggressive sun-drying and salting of the Nile fish. The process of osmosis aggressively draws the water out of the flesh and out of the bacterial cells themselves, rendering the fish inhospitable to rot.
And the sources mention the heavy use of honey and olive oil as well. Honey isn't just a sweetener. It's practically immortal, isn't it?
Honey is a fascinating substance biochemically. It is highly hygroscopic, meaning it actively absorbs moisture from its surroundings, and its extremely low water activity and naturally acidic pH make it a perfect antimicrobial seal.
So they were using it as a preservative layer?
Yes. The Egyptians would submerge meats or fruits in honey or thick layers of olive oil to cut off the oxygen supply entirely, creating an anaerobic environment that prevented spoilage.
So their fast food economy wasn't just a product of convenience, it was a triumph of applied chemistry. And the social dynamics of those markets reveal a striking contrast to the Greek model we just talked about.
Oh, massively different.
Right, because in the Greek symposium, and largely even in the public agora, women were systematically excluded from the economic exchange unless they were enslaved or working as hired entertainers. But the Egyptian sources explicitly highlight a thoroughly integrated economy.
The status of women in ancient Egyptian society was significantly more robust in terms of economic autonomy. The historical texts and visual records frequently depict Egyptian women actively managing market stalls, bartering, brewing the beer, and selling the fish right alongside the men.
So it wasn't just a boys' club like Athens.
Not at all. While the grand painted banquets of the pharaohs were highly stratified and ceremonial, the kinetic energy of the street market was a shared, egalitarian space where the daily survival of the city was negotiated openly.
The word negotiated is crucial there, because there was no standardized pricing. If you wanted that salted fish, you were haggling for it. It was a completely interactive, conversational exchange, which serves as the perfect lens to evaluate the final aspect of our deep dive.
Bringing it to the modern day.
Yes. When we synthesize these three distinct ancient cultures, the Roman masonry counters, the democratic Greek taverns, and the mobile Egyptian river markets, how does that collective ancient experience truly stack up against the hyper-sterilized modern drive-thru?
Well, the functional similarities are impossible to ignore. Both ancient and modern urbanites require highly portable, deeply affordable caloric options.
We're all just busy and hungry.
Exactly. We still rely heavily on universal flavor profiles. The Roman garum operates on the exact same neurological umami receptors as a modern fast food secret sauce or a packet of soy sauce. We still see intense vendor loyalty, just as an ancient Roman might favor a specific Thermopolium on the Via dell'Abbondanza. A modern city dweller has fierce allegiance to a specific neighborhood taco truck.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The divergence is just as profound, and it mostly centers on the concept of friction. Today, the entire architectural and technological ethos of fast food is designed to eliminate human friction.
Corporate standardization.
Right.
Yeah.
Corporate standardization ensures that a burger purchased in London tastes chemically identical to a burger purchased in Tokyo. The supply chain is invisible. You just push a button. But in the ancient world, standardization was completely absent. Quality varied wildly based on the harvest, the specific vendor's skill, and the region.
And crucially, there was a total absence of municipal hygiene regulations. There was no ancient board of health inspecting the Roman dolia for proper holding temperatures or verifying the sanitation of an Egyptian beer vat.
This is exactly why the elite Roman and Greek writers viewed these spaces with such intense suspicion. If you lacked quality control, the tavern became a wild card.
True, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, the archaeological consensus completely overrides their suspicion. These Capitolea and Popinae were not merely filthy dens of vice, they were the absolute economic bedrock of urban density.
They were employing people.
Yes. They provided a critical livelihood for freedmen, independent women, and small-time vendors who ran the stalls. They metabolized the wealth of the city and distributed it through the working class.
But we have traded that chaotic economic vitality of the ancient street corner for safety and predictability.
And it is a worthwhile trade when you consider the alternative.
It's a fair point.
I mean, this raises an important question. Do you want to risk it? Modern refrigeration and supply chain regulations mean that when you approach a drive-through window, you are not gambling your gastrointestinal health on a piece of mutton that has been sitting in a warm clay jar on a sun-baked sidewalk for 8 hours.
Okay, yes, we gain the assurance of survival. I like not getting food poisoning. But we sacrifice the tavern as the great democratic equalizer. The nature of the transaction is completely inverted.
How so?
Well, think about it. In Pompeii, you stood at a brightly painted counter, face to face with the person who butchered the meat and brewed the stew. You haggled, you gossiped about local municipal elections, you stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers. The transaction was inherently social.
It was community theater.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Today, the transaction is inherently isolating. You speak to a disembodied, digitized voice through a static-filled speaker box. You hand a piece of plastic through a small window. You receive a hermetically sealed paper bag, and you drive away in a 2-ton steel and glass box without ever making meaningful eye contact.
We have engineered the community completely out of the caloric exchange. The ancient eatery was a theater of urban survival, a space where classes were forced to mix, where new ideas were debated aloud, and where the massive, overwhelming density of the city was kept vibrant and alive.
That is the ultimate takeaway of these historical texts. We didn't invent fast food, we just sanitized it. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that bridges the ancient world directly into your living room tonight.
Oh, this should be good.
We spent a lot of time analyzing how the ancient Greeks and Romans weaponized their physical posture to signal their social class, right? If you were elite, wealthy, and powerful, you reclined in the private sanctuary of the andron. You demanded that food be brought to you, carefully isolating yourself from the noise, the smell, and the messy friction of the street.
It was the ultimate physical demarcation of status. The private recliner versus the public stander.
Exactly. If you were a commoner, you stood upright in the crowded, loud, democratic chaos of the public tavern. Now, look at the architecture of our modern dining habits. We are living in the absolute golden age of the gig economy delivery app,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
right? Anyone with a smartphone can tap a piece of glass a few times and have a meal from almost any restaurant in the city transported directly to their front door. We take that food, we sit on our heavily cushioned couches, we turn on a streaming service, and we consume our calories in total private isolation.
Without even talking to anyone.
We don't even have to look the delivery driver in the eye if we select the leave at door option. So the provocative question is this. In our relentless modern quest to eliminate all friction and maximize convenience, have we inadvertently turned everyone into the ancient reclining elite?
That is profound. By democratizing the elite experience of private, secluded dining, we may have fundamentally dismantled the communal standing room infrastructure that forged the social fabric of those ancient cities in the first place.
Has we all just retreated into our private androns, completely cutting ourselves off from the chaotic, messy, and wonderfully democratic standing room theater of the public square? It genuinely makes you look at your phone a little differently.
I know, I'm rethinking my dinner plans.
The next time you're feeling hungry, maybe resist the urge to tap the app. Go find a crowded, loud counter somewhere in your city. Stand shoulder to shoulder with a stranger. Argue about something utterly mundane and embrace the friction of the street. Just, maybe verify they aren't fermenting fish guts in the alley out back first.
Always a good policy.
Keep questioning the world around you. Keep looking for the ancient history hiding in your everyday habits, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.